All right, good morning. See you all. You ready to go, Caleb? Yes. Okay. Well, I'm anxious to complete this flyover of the 7 ecumenical councils, because for one thing, we're getting low on fuel. We need to get back to the airport, and then we want to start walking through the 7 ecumenical councils. I suppose what that means is that I've got to bone up on some of my history before I can teach at length on the ecumenical councils 6, 7, and 8. No, 6 and 7. So we're at the 4th ecumenical council. What I'm wanting to accomplish in this flyover is to bring into view, you might say, the one or two fundamental issues that are at the heart of Christology, and also to begin getting a sense of why this is critically important, why it was so critically important for the Church as she entered into the world of Hellenistic philosophy to proclaim the gospel and even to clothe it in philosophical categories, so that the mind of, especially the Hellenistic mind, but actually even the Jewish mind, that already had the law, could confess Christ correctly, truly. So much is at stake in the biblical confession of Jesus as the Christ. I mean, I think even St. John himself tells us what is at stake. He says in 1 John, test the spirits to see if they are of God. Any spirit that denies that Jesus is the Christ come in the flesh is not of God. It is of the Antichrist. So, and I would maintain that we are seeing today, we have been seeing over the last 200-300 years, but if not longer, the consequences of a Christology, Christological confession that may appear biblical, but it is not biblical. In the demise, the disintegration of the churches, to the point that they don't. I wonder if they even read the Bible anymore. Teachings that are very clear in Holy Scripture have been jettisoned, denied, and on the grounds that we know. I mean, honestly, we know better. We're more advanced. They were old. They were outdated. We need to update our theological understanding, and the Bible was written at a time. It was written 2,000 years ago, right? So it's outdated. We need to update it. And you see the consequences. I mean, churches that were strong, even though their Christological confession wasn't thoroughly biblical, nonetheless, 30, 40 years ago, they were still strong. I have seen in my own lifetime, and I've gotten to the point where I can say I've lived a full life. I have seen in my own lifetime, the precipitous decline of so-called Christianity. And you're seeing it in this country. You're seeing the consequences in this country. Darkness, the confusion, just all kinds of nonsense going on, and some of it in the name of the church. So this is critically important. So we're at the 4th ecumenical council, and we're wanting to bring into view, as I said, one or two of the issues, the one or two issues that are at the heart of all this. And the issue, really, I think you could say the issue has to do with the mystery. I'll call it the mystery. That is, well, the mystery that is finally, after about a time of 325, let's say, till 453, so let's say 125 years, that is finally centered on the term hypostasis and prosopon. Now, These are generally translated into English as person. But person is not really a good... we have to understand what we mean by person. And what do you mean by person? Person is actually the Latin equivalent of prosopon, which is persona, which, as I said, is a mask. So it designates the outward appearance. It's the mask that the actors on the stage would speak through. So if Christ is the prosopon, or the persona, the question is, what's behind the mask? If Christ is a mask, what's behind the mask? Who's behind the mask? So the issue is how to maintain and to articulate clearly the unity of subject. The unity of subject. Subject. That also is a synonym of hypostasis. Subject. Under, sub, hypo, under. I don't know what Latin is, the Latin for yet is. This is a standing. So I'm guessing subject, that which is, I want to say something that's thrown underneath. Yet just sounds like something that you throw. But, yes, Matthew?
Well, you can look, by etymological reason, you can look at things like conjecture or object.
Okay.
Or,
so the point being?
Well, it's... conjecture is like where you stand.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Or I'm going to propose something and stand underneath it.
Okay, so the object would be standing against, maybe?
Right.
Okay. So hypostasis, in other words, that which stands underneath. Are you going to understand the unity of subject that is Christ in terms of the mask, in terms of what you see? Well, you see a man. Who's behind the man? Do you have two subjects? Two standings underneath? Do you have Jesus as the humanity and the Logos as the divinity, the divine nature, the divine Son of God? That is the... I don't really know that there's any of these bishops. These are all bishops who are involved in these Christological controversies of the first 7 ecumenical councils. I really don't know that these bishops would have gone so far as to maintain, yes, there are two people behind Christ. Not even Nestorius would say that. He wanted to maintain that there's one, he would say persona, one prosopon. He would not want to say one hypostasis. But why would he not want to say one hypostasis? Well, that gets us into the second issue. Hypostasis at this time is a synonym for essence. In Greek, ousia, in Latin, essence. So it's, in English, you might say being. It's what it is. What it is that makes it to be, that makes something to be what it is. He would want to, so for him, if you say that there is one hypostasis, that means for him that there be only one essence. Nonetheless, so in order for him to maintain, in order for Nestorius and for those of his school, which was the Antiochian school, the eastern part of the empire, they would want to stress the full integrity of the human nature behind the mask, behind the prosopon of Christ. And they would do so to the point that they would minimize the unity of subject, and speak of the human nature, the humanity behind the prosopon, as though it was a subject. And they would make it a subject. They would talk of it as a subject, and you even see that in the Latin West. You see Augustine doing the same thing. In some places, Augustine's Christological language is quite good, but in other places, for example, when he's talking about Christ on the cross, it's almost as though you read it and you can't tell. Is he talking about who was on the cross for Augustine? And the way he writes, it sounds like it's very much it's like Jesus of Nazareth as a different subject from the divine Logos. And this difficulty of putting these together, the full humanity of Jesus, together with the unity of subject, so that it's just one subject. You see it playing out even today. Karl Rahner was one of my foils, in my thesis, in his theological investigations. I started, I kind of started drooling, because here was a beautiful place where I can really give it to Rahner. Because he says, how can there be a nature without its own prosopon? So he wants to make the human nature of Jesus as his own subject, his own, his own independent reference. What's a point of reference? So that it's as though he wants to talk, just like Augustine did, as I just described. He wants to talk about Jesus as though he is a different subject from the Logos. So that this is a real philosophical issue that is still with us today, outside of Orthodoxy. So when we say that the early fathers wanted to maintain a unity of subject, even that has to be explained. When you say unity of subject, do you mean two subjects coming together to form this Christic mask? In that case, you haven't really solved it. Then the Christ does not begin to exist until these two subjects come together, Jesus and the divine Logos. Or do you mean to say that there's only one subject, both before and after the union of the natures? What do you mean? So this is to maintain that there is one subject of attribution. In other words, just one. But you also want to maintain the fullness of the human nature, the full integrity of the human nature. This, as we with Apollinaris, this is when this issue begins to come really to the fore. Apollinaris, Apollinaris of Laodicea, was Bishop of Laodicea, and he was. We're back in the 4th century now, and he presents his Christological solution in about 378, the year 378. So it's about 3 years before the Third Ecumenical Council, which is in 380, the Second Ecumenical Council in 381. And as we saw, his solution was, the emphasis of his solution was to maintain the unity of subject completely. So for him, in order to maintain that unity of subject as one subject, not two subjects coming together in a union, but one subject, before, during, and after the union, what he did was the subject for him, the hypostasis for him, was the Logos, or the divine Logos. So what he did in order to maintain the unity of subject was he just had the Logos clothing himself with flesh and soul. But the mind, no. He did not have the mind. He took the place of the mind. There is the beginning of the Christological controversy, and here is also the disclosure, if you will, of the Christological problem, the riddle that has to be solved. Because the mind, the reason that Apollinaris did not want the mind to be there was because he assumed that the mind, by its very nature, is resistant to God. So if you have Jesus, if you have Christ with a full human mind, you basically have two subjects. So you also see that the mind, consciousness, awareness, is associated with the person, speaking, as we would say today, is the person, not the nature, but the person. So if you have the human mind in Christ, then you have a human subject. You have a human actor. You have a human willer. And that means that there's going to be this perpetual, eternal conflict with the divine Logos. So through get rid of that conflict, he gets rid of the mind. St. Gregory of Nazianzus, who became Patriarch of Constantinople shortly before the Second Ecumenical Council in 381, he is the champion of the Orthodox against the Apollinaris, and argues or points out, he shows that if the mind is not assumed, if the human mind is not involved in the Christic union of the Logos becoming flesh, then that means that the mind is not saved. Whatever is not assumed is not saved. What is assumed is saved. In other words, what is involved in the union is saved. So that means that the mind is not saved. Okay, so this becomes now, here are the terms now of the Christological riddle. How can you maintain the unity of subject and maintain a full human nature, which includes the mind, or as the fathers would say, a reasonable soul, a soul possessed of mind? There's the problem. There's the riddle. And you have two schools at this time that are the dominant schools of the Orthodox world: Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, western part of Syria. The Antiochian school and the fathers or the bishops who subscribe to the Antiochian way of thinking, they're referred to as the Easterners, which is a bit odd for me. I have to do some recalibration of my mind every time I read that, because when I think of Easterners, I think of the Egyptians, I think of the Coptics, the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Oriental Orthodox Church we call them. But at this time, the Oriental Church would be the Antiochians and farther east. So that means that the Egyptians would be the Westerners, the Alexandrians would be the Westerners, and that's because that would include Rome. The Antiochian school stressed the fullness and the integrity of the human nature. The Alexandrian school wanted to stress the unity of subject as the divine Logos before, during, and after the union. So it's interesting to read the texts. At this time, you have after that follow Apollinarius. With the Alexandrians, you'll see them talking about the unity of subject as the Logos before, during, and after the union. There is no other subject. But then in order to solve the Christological riddle, they don't actually solve it, they just assert it. So the divine Logos assumed a full human nature, including a reasonable soul. But they don't explain how that could be. Whereas the Antiochians, they're doing the other thing. They're stressing the fullness, the full integrity of the human nature. And then they assert unity of subject. But the way they talk as though there are two subjects. The way the Alexandrians talk, they're talking as though there's no human mind. You could complain that the mind is not really a factor in their Christology. But so the Alexandrians would not want to maintain that there was not a reasonable soul in Christ. They wanted to maintain that, but they didn't know how to do that. And the Antiochians did not want to say that there are two sons. And they would insist that they're not saying two sons. But you read their text and they are saying two sons. And I'm not the only one who sees that. That's Father Florowski also, and Father Meindorf. My mentor, Father Meindorf, and perhaps his mentor, Father Florowski, to some degree. They see it as well. So here's the Christological riddle. And you're going back and forth, and this, how to find a formula. Now, and again, at this point, I can only assert. I cannot explain. I want to explain why this is important, but I can only assert. Finding a formula is absolutely critical. That will clearly and precisely, in philosophical language, yes, confess Christ in the biblical way. It's absolutely critical. And as I said at the outset, I think we're seeing the evidence of it even in our own day, in our own country. When the Christological confession is not grounded and rooted completely in the biblical experience, all hell breaks loose. So here we have these two schools that are going back and forth, And the Christological issue is complicated. I should say that the arguments back and forth, it's complicated by, guess what? Geopolitics. At the Second Ecumenical Council, 381, Constantinople, the Holy Fathers composed the canon, or they set out the canon that elevates the see of Constantinople on a par with Rome. That means that the ancient sees of Alexandria and Antioch have been demoted. There's already a friction between the sees of Alexandria and Antioch, competing for political power in the empire. And then, of course, there's Rome, that has always seen itself as the first of equals, and they were treated as such. The Roman bishop, if there ever was an appeal that wanted to be made, if somebody felt that they'd been treated unjustly, wherever they were in the ecumene, the world of the church, they would appeal to Rome, and everybody accepted that. That's what you do. Rome is the final arbiter of any dispute. So here you have Rome, that is the see of Peter and Paul. They are the first among equals, and here's this upstart Constantinople, just recently built but I think it was completed. The city of Constantinople was completed in the year 330, asserting the bishop there, the patriarch, the bishop calling himself a patriarch, and asserting that he is on par with Rome. Okay, so there's that political card that is now that has been thrown into the fight, but it would be a mistake. Okay, and so so you see geopolitics playing playing as itself as a factor throughout, even in the 5th century and into the 6th century, with the triumph of, as it were, of the Byzantine Church, Cappadocia, modern day Turkey, at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. That was really kind of the triumph of Constantinople, which was another blow to Alexandria and to Antioch. And you can see after that, you can see Alexandria and Antioch kind of withdrawing into themselves, and distancing themselves from the Roman Empire, which would be centered on Constantinople and Rome or Milan. And so they you can see them distancing themselves, and so that again you see this political factor playing out in the Monophysite controversies of the 5th, the last half of the full of the 5th century, into the 6th and into the 7th and 8th centuries. You see that those geopolitical factors playing themselves out. However, the geopolitics was not the decisive factor in these controversies. The decisive factor was truly a confession of Christ that is clothed, yes, in philosophical categories, philosophical terms, but is also faithful to the Bible and the biblical proclamation, the biblical revelation of Christ. So once Apollinaris has been refuted, at least on paper, Apollinaris was not defeated at the at the Second Ecumenical Council. Apollinarianism Apollinarianism, not so much its doctrine of the absence of a reasonable soul in Christ, but more of its ethos. You see that Apollinarian ethos, or whatever the ethos, you could even call it a docetic ethos. You can see it playing out in all the Monophysite variations of Christology. And the ethos, interesting, Father Florovsky, I thought that I had seen it myself. And so I was delighted when I was reading Father Florowski that he was confirming what I was seeing, that Augustinianism, the doctrine of predestination, Calvinism, the doctrine of the sovereignty of God to the point of predestinating you have no choice in the matter, that's just a playing out of monothelitism. That's another form of monophysitism. In other words, it's the ethos that drives all of these kind of monophysitic or docetic Christologies, which is, Father Florowski calls it, an anthropological minimalism. And what we mean by that is that it's kind of a negative view of humanity, that the human needs to be overpowered, as it were, that the will that the human will is by its very nature recalcitrant. It's contrary to God, and so it's the divine who comes and just kind of takes over. There's no mind in Apollinarianism, but in monophysitism, the human nature, while they assert that there's a full human nature, it really doesn't play any part. What part does it really play? In the mystery of Christ. So it works itself out into this kind of the human will plays virtually no part. The human mind plays virtually no part in the mystery of salvation. Jonathan?
So you're bringing in this, what was the phrase, something anthropology?
Anthropological minimalism, he calls it.
So this is this negative view of human nature that affects Christology.
Yeah.
And so I'm also thinking this goes back to how is Genesis read? How is the fall? What is the fall?
Yes.
Because I was shocked to find that the traditional how we think of what the fall is, it's really Augustine's version.
Yes.
Whereas all the other Eastern fathers talk about it very differently.
They're very different.
And even to the point where eating the apple, I think it's Ephraim or something, eating the apple actually isn't the fall. The fall is when they do not reconcile with God.
Yes.
Which is a very different.
Yes.
So image of that there's something in us that's just automatically corrupted as soon as you're born.
Yes.
Is this also playing a role in what you're seeing of when you lose Christology, you lose the right anthropology?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, that's a good point. The Christological controversies is really all about anthropology. When philosophy was born out of the womb of the myth, you could play with it. When the waters were broke, when the mother myth's waters broke, I say because the waters, that's a big theme in mythology. When they broke and gave birth to the child philosophy, the child came out in the form of the first philosophical question, the first philosophical riddle, the riddle of the one and the many. The doctrine of the Trinity, which was hammered out in the 3rd century and in the 4th century of the Church, and was really kind of capped at the Second Ecumenical Council in 381. That is the Church's answer to the philosophical riddle of the one and the many. And it is an answer, but in order to understand the answer of the Trinity to the question of the one and the many, you have to break your own mind. Your own mind has to be shattered, because this is something completely different. I'm telling you guys, this is a vision of reality that is completely different from what we have been trained to think and how we've been trained to think from pre-K to graduate school. It's a completely different. And even we who think we're Christians, we still think in this kind of scientific, philosophical way. We do not think in a theological way, which is another reason that shows why these issues of the ecumenical council are so critical. What's at stake is not just to say the doctrine of the Trinity correctly. It's also to come to a true understanding of the world and of myself, my creation. Who am I by nature? Because this is what's going to influence and direct my pursuit of healing, of salvation. But now, okay, so that was there was a second not so much a riddle, it could be cast as a riddle, but it's like in the pre-Socratics, there's called these pre-Socratics, they're called 7 Socratic sages before Socrates. And the legend is that they came together. Philosophy has now been going on for 200-300 years or so. So they're going to distill the essence of their wisdom that they have come to in this philosophical reasoning. And they inscribe what they inscribe at the Temple of Delphi, the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, the essence of philosophy, the essence of the philosophical pursuit. And it is, if anybody know, I don't want to take anybody's thunder away. Does anybody know what that distilled essence is?
Was it Wesche?
Say that again? Yes, exactly. Know thyself. Know thyself. But how you understand yourself, of course, is going to be based on whatever your hypothesis is. Remember the term hypothesis, the starting point? The thesis that lies underneath all of your inquiry? So, your hypothesis, how you understand reality, is how you understand, let's say, the one and the many, how you understand the doctrine of the Trinity, is going to govern how you know yourself. Christology is, in fact, the Church's answer to that dictum of the pre-Socratic sages. Know thyself. You want to know yourself? You must come to know Christ, as he is given in the Bible. You cannot know Christ according to philosophical categories, because, okay, I'll go back to what I've said before a number of times. The philosophical way of thinking is in terms of what it is. The theological way of thinking is, who are you? Who are you? And I find it fascinating and confirming. Again, Father Florowski shows, I rest on him, because he says that ancient philosophy had no word, no term for what we would call the person, for individuality. And then he says, when he's talking about the Fourth Ecumenical Council at the Chalcedon in 451, when the meaning of the term hypostasis and prosopon relative to the terms ousia, or essence, and thesis, or nature, when that is finally being delineated and defined, he refers to Pope Leo's tome that was read at the Council of Chalcedon, and it's a typical Roman description of the Christ. It's just cast basically all in biblical terms, but there's no real philosophical effort to explain how Christ is one in two natures in one. There's no effort to explain it. So, as Father Florowski describes, it's kind of a luminous fog. It's blurred. It's not in focus. What's not in focus? Well, what we mean by person. And Saint Leo, Pope Leo says that this was the problem with Leo's tome. He had no term for person. I think that's fascinating, because you think about we understand a person as who you are, right? And as I have tried to show, you cannot say who someone is. The minute you start trying to say who someone is, you simply succeed in saying what they are. And even the concept of person, the who, we can't even talk about the who without treating the who as a concept, as a what. And you see that happening in the Christological controversies. Okay, let's say that the hypostasis now designates what we say as the person, or the who. Well, now we start treating the hypostasis as a what. So we start parsing the hypostasis. We start analyzing it, trying to come to an understanding of the who. But, guess what? The more you parse, the more you lose the who. And yet, the who is the only mystery that can be known. You don't know a what. You know only whose. I know you. I know you, but I come to know you as who you are. How? By somebody describing you to me? No. I come to know you as who you are only when I come to know, only when we come into relationship. Come to know, come together and start talking to one another, start being together. This is huge. And we'll we'll talk about it more when we go back into our walkthrough. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. So Matthew, okay. So I'll do the walkthrough real quick, so that next Sunday we can doing we'll do the flyover real quick. So the third ecumenical council, 433, is in Ephesus. It is the issue of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos. Is she Theotokos? Is she Christotokos? What are we going to call her? But that is a Christological issue. The issue of the Theotokos is a Christological issue because it has to do with who was born of her. And if it was a man with a reasonable soul, how can you say that it was the divine Logos? Though divine Logos is divine, he's impassible by nature. He's begotten of the Father from eternity. He was not made. He's not a creature. How can you say that the divine Logos was born of the Theotokos? This was Nestorius' problem. So he would say, we'll say that Christ was born of her. Christotokos, we'll call her, not Theotokos. Well, it was established that she is Theotokos because the one who was born of her was the divine Logos, begotten of the Father before all ages, begotten of made, He's the one who was born of her, but he was born of her in his human nature. You can see the mystery of the who starting to come out, starting to reveal itself, even as they're struggling with their terms. The Fourth Ecumenical Council, Council of Chalcedon, they take Leo's tone and they use his language, but they measure it against St. Cyril of Alexandria, who was the chief opponent of Nestorius at the Third Ecumenical Council. And they merge the two together, and once the Holy Fathers decide that St. Leo is saying what St. Cyril is saying, even though they're both saying the same, they're saying the same thing, but they're saying it in a different way. They accept Leo's tone, and Leo's tone is incorporated into the definition of Chalcedon, which is centered on that Jesus Christ is the divine Word of God, who, again, there's no word in the Greek for that, it's there, but just the relative pronoun, who became flesh and was incarnate and became man. In other words, he became a man with a reasonable soul, consubstantial with the Father in his divinity, consubstantial with us in his humanity. But you notice throughout the whole definition, you can see that they're wrestling with the absence of any term that can nail what a who is. And you wonder, is there any term that can nail what the who is? Because the who is not a what, But it's the same one who was born of the Virgin Mary that was begotten of the Father. It's the same one who is consubstantial to us and consubstantial to the Father. The same one who was crucified, the same one who was resurrected, the same one who was ascended, the same one. It's the Logos and the hypostasis. This is what the Council of Chalcedon establishes: is that the hypostasis, the individual, the prosopon of Christ, is not human. There's no human hypostasis in Christ, a human person. It's the divine person, the divine hypostasis. Well, perhaps you can guess that this is problematic, because there's not a terminology, there's not the philosophical maturity yet, the theological maturity yet, really to understand what's being said. Philosophy and philosophical categories are still too much at the fore, still too much dominant. And so actually the Council of Chalcedon was received by the Church no more better than was Council of Nicaea in the 325. A period of bitter conflict and controversy continued up into the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553, known as what? Constantinople II. And this is when Justinian, the Emperor Justinian, used the definitions of that council to assert that the definition of faith at Chalcedon was faithful to St. Cyril of Alexandria, and it was faithful to Leo. So he was trying to bridge both Antioch and Alexandria. He was trying to heal their animosity from each other. But here's at 553 is the if you will, the cap of the again, I don't like this term, but this is what they use, the term synthesis of Alexandria and Antioch that was accomplished at Chalcedon by under the Byzantine emperor. So you can say that this is when Byzantine Christianity is formed, you might say, which is formed from the roots of Alexandria and Antioch, which are formed from the roots of the Bible. So that the Byzantine Christianity, the Byzantine expression of the Christian faith, we would assert, we would affirm, is the biblical of faith. It is the faith of the Bible that has not gone off into the extremes of the Antiochian school or the Alexandrian school. So, but this anthropological minimalism that is the ethos driving Apollinaris and then driving monophysitism in general, it does not in any way die, not in any way, after the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553. And the controversy continues. It continues into the 7th century, into 681, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, known as Constantinople III, because it was the third council held in the city of Constantinople. This, between Constantinople II, the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553, and the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 681, Constantinople III, there is monophysitism is trying to assert itself in a different form that has not been condemned. And the form it takes is that of monothelitism, or monoenergism. Okay, if we're going to say that Christ is one person in two natures, all right, well, we'll get around our discomfort of that one human nature that is still asserted to be fully there. We'll say that there's nonetheless the wills, the energies, the activities of each nature come together to fuse into one will. So we'll say that there's one will in Christ. Before we could say one nature and get away with it, we can't get away with that anymore. Obviously, I'm caricaturing their reasoning. But so we'll say that there's just one will, one energy. And you might say that it's at the Sixth Ecumenical Council where the issue of the will now is at the fore. Here is where the Christological problem, the Christological riddle, is now manifested in all of its glory. This is the issue. Here's the nub of the issue. The will of man, the will of the human nature. Can it be united with the divine and maintain its full integrity? And the answer is yes, absolutely, because in fact the human will, the human nature is not fully integral, not fully itself until it is in union and in obedience to the will of God. I mean, you can see how this is the anthropology that is here. There's an anthropology that's being proclaimed here, and it's not Augustinian. Predestination is just another form of monothelitism. It cancels the will. Your will has no part in it. So here's the affirmation of the human will. It goes actually back to the Third Ecumenical Council, of the Theotokos, as the burning bush. Who has ever seen a bush burning and it's not consumed? This is something completely different than what we have ever seen before. And this is the vision that is given to us of human nature, something completely different that the philosophers never saw before. That we, the created, could be on fire with the uncreated fire. And instead of our will being canceled, or instead of our nature being diminished or destroyed, in fact, it comes to fruition, comes to fulfillment. This is what it is to be man. This is what it is to be human. It is to be burning with the fire, the uncreated fire of God, and not being consumed, but rather being deified. And in being deified, you become truly human. That's the mystery of it. So, but this still not finished. So we go into now the 8th century, 787. The 7th Ecumenical Council, by the way, the fathers of the 7th Ecumenical Council are who we are commemorating today. And then that council, it gave its definition, but the definition was not ratified until 843. Now we're in the period of iconoclasm. It's like, okay, this monophysitic ethos that has been now squashed in terms of nature. Okay, we can't say one nature anymore. Now it's been squashed in terms of will. Okay, we can't say one will anymore. We have to say two wills. Its last gasp effort, you might say, is iconoclasm. All right, then let's say that you cannot depict Christ in an icon because he is divine. And if you depict him in an icon, you're depicting the divine, which is strictly prohibited in the Old Testament. So when the Holy Fathers come together in the Seventh Ecumenical Council and affirm the not just icons as okay, but even as essential to Christian worship. Why? Because the icon affirms, it proclaims that God, the Word, who, remember, in the Greek Orthodox Church, you come into the church, and there in the dome, stretching over the whole nave, and everybody under there is Christ Pantocrator, Christ the Almighty. That Christ has become flesh, so that we can paint him, we can depict him. Goodness sakes, isn't the Bible just a bunch of icons in words? We depict him with words. We depict the incarnate Christ in words. So of course we should be able to depict him also in color, in paints, in figure. So the icon is the full, it's like the cap of all these seven ecumenical councils and the Christology that they're proclaiming, that God the Word became flesh, and we can see the invisible, we can hear the inaudible, like St. John says in their first epistle. We can touch the intangible because he has become flesh. And the one that we are seeing and hearing and touching in the flesh is none other than Christ Pantocrator, Christ the Son of God, begotten of the Father before all ages. So the icon for us, it's not only affirming and proclaiming the reality of the incarnation, but the term icon in and of itself, just by its very meaning, it means mirror. An icon, it's an image, it's a mirror. So that means the icon is reflecting what's there. Specifically, it's reflecting what's there in you, the viewer. You're looking into a mirror. So what are you seeing when you look into an icon? You're seeing the kingdom of heaven that is within you, that has been reflected in you. So, all right, so we need to go. But nonetheless, we're almost on empty. We're going to fly back to the airport, and next Sunday we'll get off the plane and we'll start our walk through. But for now, we need to get up there. Tanya is directing us this morning. Let's have as many singers as we can, helping the singing, and especially sopranos. We want you up there. All right? So.